Hello friend. I want to tell you about the Škoda Octavia car. The second generation Škoda Octavia is a real market hit. The car is highly valued due to its very practical interior and proven Volkswagen technology. The car is expensive, but despite this, sellers have no problem finding a buyer. It turns out, however, that not all Octavias are as perfect as they are commonly believed. This is especially true for the petrol versions, which are not written about as often as the popular diesels. Today we will deal with them, because interest in diesels is decreasing, and buying an Octavia with a petrol unit is very risky. Which engines are good and which should be avoided? Technically, the Octavia is no different to the Golf V and is a classic in the segment. The chassis is a simple design with McPherson struts at the front and a slightly more advanced multi-link at the rear. Customers could choose a version with drive on 1 or 4 axles. In 4x4 versions, the rear wheels were driven by a multi-plate clutch from Haldex. This was standard in the Scout version with raised ground clearance and a different body style. Only 4-cylinder engines were available under the hood. Engines in a used Škoda Octavia. The range of engines is hard to count on the fingers of both hands and feet, because the Octavia had practically all engines offered in Škoda cars. From the tiny, 80 horsepower 1.4 MPI, which is a good source of power for the Fabia at most, to the very powerful, powering the RS version 2.0 TFSI with 200 horsepower. Petrol engines can be divided into 3 groups. These are classic units with indirect injection MPI with capacities of 1.4 and 1.6 liters. The smaller one is not very popular because it is simply not suitable for this model. The larger one is very popular despite some lack of power. It was offered in several versions in VW Group cars, but in the Octavia it most often has 102 horsepower. The second group are naturally aspirated FSI units, which are the margin of the market. These are slightly more modern designs with direct injection. They were intended to complement the MPI engine range. These are engines with capacities of 1.6 and 2.0 L and power of 115 and 150 horsepower. The third group of petrol engines is the TSI, TFSI family. Turbocharged engines with direct petrol injection appeared to replace the naturally aspirated FSI versions, which occurred entirely in the third generation of the Octavia. These are engines with capacities of 1.2 and 1.4 liters, as well as 1.8 and 2 liters. Their pairing is not accidental, because in reality these are just 2 units that come in 2 capacity versions. The power they achieve is 105 hydrogen phosphide, 1.2, 122 hydrogen phosphide, 1.4, 160 hydrogen phosphide, 1.8, and 200 hydrogen phosphide, 2.0. Diesels can also be divided into 3 groups. The first includes classic 1.9 TDI engines in modern 105 horsepower versions and 2 types of 2.0 TDI engines, with pump injectors and common rail injection. Regardless of the design, both engines achieved 140 or 170 hydrogen phosphide, depending on the version. A separate topic is the smallest and at the same time the most modern diesel 1.6 TDI, which replaced the already outdated 1.9 TDI in 2009. It offers, like its predecessor, 105 HP of power. Recommended petrol engine. 1.6 MPI with 102 HP as a durable, refined and resistant to the hardships of use design. This is the only engine in the range that can be successfully gasified. Recommended diesel engine. 1.6 TDI in newer or 2.0 TDI, CR, in older Octavias. The first for people counting money at the pump, the second for those who value high performance. Buyers of the oldest Octavia are doomed to the 1.9 TDI engine. What's wrong with the Škoda Octavia? Let's start with engines and try to choose worthy of attention and not recommended. We deliberately skip the 1.4 MPI unit, because we can't imagine using such a car, and although it is a good engine, we strongly advise against it due to its lack of power. The basic 1.6 MPI engine generating 102 HP with an 8-valve head proved to be so good that it was offered until the end of production in 2013. It is a simple and durable design that has practically no flaws. The only drawback is fluctuating RPMs, which may be caused by the ignition or intake system. Sometimes, throttle calibration helps, sometimes replacing ignition coils or spark plugs. Even in authorized services, it is difficult to provide a clear answer to the question of the cause of this state of affairs. The fact that you can drive with such a defect without major consequences is a completely different matter. This should be the end of the subject, but it is worth adding that this is an engine that tolerates gas operation perfectly. Škoda even offered factory LPG installations for this version. Interestingly, many users complain about them, although the factory installations were Omegas by Landi Renzo, one of the best installations of this type on the market. The cause is probably neglected service. The same displacement is also available in the more modern 1.6 FSI unit with direct petrol injection. Its typical faults include carbon buildup on the intake valves, a stretched timing chain, chain tensioner failures and control electronics failures. It is not a bad engine, but if it only offers 115 HP with a much higher failure rate and theoretically lower fuel consumption, then it is not worth considering at all with the 1.6 MPI. The next engine is the 2.0 FSI, which already offers a solid 150 HP and 200 Nm. This is a unit that you can have mixed feelings about. On the one hand, it is quite troublesome. On the other hand, eliminating faults is not particularly expensive. It offers good performance, which is appreciated, but workshops also appreciate the service of cleaning the cylinder head from carbon deposits, which cause the engine to run unevenly. In some units, the camshafts wear out, but it is suspected that this is caused by low engine oil level. This in turn is the result of excessive oil consumption. Maybe not to such an extent that it qualifies the engine for repair, but it is worth checking its condition more often. In addition, the 2.0 FSI unit struggles with minor sensor failures. If you take care of this engine and react to minor problems in time, it turns out to be a grateful source of power, but you have to reckon with quite high fuel and oil consumption during intensive use. It is also worth filling up with better quality petrol, PB98. Now it's time for the TSI, TFSI family, and we'll start with the EA111 engine, i.e. 1.2 and 1.4 TSI. Both engines are twin designs. The smaller one copes with a more loaded car only moderately, but for city driving or with up to 2 passengers on board, it proves dynamic and economical. It reaches 105 HP and 175 Nm at 1,550 revolutions per minute. Skillful driving makes fuel consumption low. Unfortunately, this engine struggles with some problems, and the most common are timing chain stretching and tensioner failure. Fortunately, a repair based on replacements costs about $100 to $200. Unfortunately, this has to be done quite often. Factory parts lasted no more than 40,000 kilometers, so most engines have already had these elements replaced. This should not be postponed, because it can destroy the engine. The turbo is also fragile, but this is not a rule. There are turbochargers that last 200,000 kilometers. Others have to be replaced after 100,000 kilometers. Fortunately, this is not a particularly expensive part. Rarely, and mainly in heavily loaded cars, the head gasket fails. All of the above problems also apply to the 1.4 TSI engine with 122 hydrogen phosphide, some to a greater extent, timing, others to a lesser extent, head gaskets and turbo. This is a unit with ideal parameters for the Octavia, but unfortunately it is burdened with a high risk of serious damage. It provides very good performance and low fuel consumption, but also generates high operating costs. Apart from the things that break down in the smaller 1.2 TSI, there is also the possibility of a cracked piston, although this problem is more common in the more powerful versions with a compressor and turbocharger. Such a failure definitely ends the life of the unit. Apart from the typical defects of the EA111 design, there is one more thing worth knowing. Its durability is approximately 200,000 kilometers. Above this mileage, it is already a piggy bank, not worth putting money into. Therefore, if you buy an Octavia II with a 1.2 TSI or 1.4 TSI engine, only with a documented mileage, slightly exceeding 100,000 kilometers, the lower the better. In addition, immediately after purchase, it is best to replace the entire timing drive as a preventive measure. The EA888 engine, i.e. 1.8 TSI and 2.0 TFSI, is a slightly different subject. Powerful engines are not so common on the market anymore, and the 2.0 TFSI only powered the Octavia RS. It is also much more refined. Unfortunately, the very dynamic 1.8 TSI unit has a flaw in the form of fragile piston rings. The effect? High oil consumption, which eventually becomes unbearable and the engine must be repaired. We advise against replacing it with a used engine, and a general overhaul using factory parts is terribly expensive. The only sensible solutions are to sell the car or repair it by modifying the pistons and installing better rings. The results are good, but there are few workshops that deal with such treatments. It is possible to do it slightly cheaper, saving on gaskets and, for example, timing drive or cylinder head regeneration, but this is only a makeshift and substandard repair, after which the failure may return. Apart from piston rings, users struggle with sensor failures and carbon deposits, but this is a smaller problem. Interestingly, not all Octavia 1.8 TSI owners have problems with oil. One can agree with the theory that these are well-run engines, operated properly in the context of operating temperature, warming up and cooling down, and with regularly checked oil level. So which engine to choose? The 1.6 MPI is a sure thing, but you shouldn't expect good performance from it, and fuel consumption could also be better, around 7 to 9 L, 100 kilometers. Conditionally recommendable are the 1.2 TSI engines, which you can manage with and are the most economical, 6 to 7 L, 100 kilometers. If the 1.4 TSI version, then only with low mileage, while we simply advise against the 1.8 TSI. Unless the previous owner modified the pistons and confirms this with appropriate documents, then you can take a risk, and if the oil problem does not appear, such a car will please the owner. Unfortunately, such a version needs a lot of fuel, because it encourages dynamic driving. The Octavia RS with the 2.0 TFSI unit is a slightly different topic and an individual matter, because the engine is more refined than the 1.8 TSI, but the car will still be quite expensive to operate. What breaks down apart from engines? For example, dual-clutch, automatic DSG gearboxes, in which after 150–200,000 kilometers there are costly failures of the control mechanism and clutches. It should also be remembered that even petrol units with DSG have a dual-mass flywheel. A dual-clutch gearbox can only be recommended for cars with low mileage, with documented oil changes. The interior, although practical, is far behind, for example, the Golf in terms of quality. This is especially true for pre-facelift versions, where the upholstery is worn out, and the seat materials and door panels are destroyed. Another problem is leaky doors, especially the rear ones, due to poor seals. In older models, corrosion appears on the edges of the bonnet, boot lid or doors, and even in newer ones, the paintwork may peel. In some cars, the air conditioning compressor freezes, which is caused by a faulty compressor series. Electrical faults are less common, but still more common than in sister cars from Volkswagen and Audi. The suspension deserves the highest praise, as it is exceptionally durable and lasts about 100,000 kilometers without replacing any parts. You don't have to worry about the multi-link rear axle, because it can easily withstand 200,000 kilometers of use, and there is no shortage of replacement parts. The braking system is free from any defects. Is it worth it? This is a good question, because in relation to what it offers, the Octavia is an expensive car. On the other hand, If you want to buy a practical liftback with such a large boot, you have to choose from higher class cars, because other compacts rarely come in such versions, and this applies to older models. It is also difficult to find a more capacious station wagon. The Škoda Octavia can be recommended in two cases. First, if someone is looking for a cheap to maintain and capacious car with a gas installation or a not very powerful engine. In this case, our type is any Octavia II 1.6 MPI. However, we recommend installing the gas installation yourself, of good quality, so that it does not cause major problems, especially not aggravating the phenomenon of rev fluctuations. The second case is for people looking for a capacious compact with a diesel engine. In this situation, our pick is the Octavia II after facelift, preferably a station wagon, in a good equipment version. If you are looking for a compact car with good performance, but necessarily a petrol engine, you can choose a 1.4 TSI engine with low mileage, but we recommend looking for another car. In general, in our opinion, the Škoda Octavia is worth buying mainly because of the successful 1.6 TDI and 2.0 TDI diesel engines and a very functional body. If these are not your priorities, you will easily find better or cheaper cars. Thanks for listening to me. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and rate my video. If you know of any problems with this car that I haven't mentioned, be sure to write about them in the comments.
I have good news for you. Now, if you are planning to buy a used car, or learn more about your car, you no longer need to search for the information you need on the internet. We have collected everything in one place for you, on the website carme.pro. Here you can find out everything about the car, what breaks and at what mileage, any problems with engines, chassis or gearboxes, which trim levels are better not to mess with, and how not to lose money buying a used car. You will learn all this on carme.pro.